Good morning, everyone, and thank you for all attending the RTA's meeting of the Board of Directors. I want to review a few guidelines for today's meeting with which I'm sure you're all familiar with. For the members who are here and present, thank you for being here as you always are. Please turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and off when you are finished, because we do record these meetings and we want to eliminate background noise. I will call on those with questions or comments for those attending in person. For remote members, keep your audio on mute as much as possible to minimize background noise, which may impair the recording. And when you have a question or comment, please raise your virtual hand, and the board secretary will call on board members who have raised their hands one at a time. When she calls on you, please try to remember to unmute yourself and lower your hand at the appropriate time on your laptop or computer. With that said, I will now call this meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority to order, and will everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Secretary, would you take the roll, please?
Good morning, everyone. Director Carey?
Here.
Director Colson?
Here.
Director Fuentes?
Here.
Director Gathing? Here. Director Gorman?
Here.
Director Groven?
Here.
Director Lewis?
Here.
Director Melvin? Director Pang?
Here.
Director Rotondo?
Here.
Director Ross?
Here.
Director Sager?
Here.
Director Yonan?
Here.
And Chairman Dillard.
Present.
We have 13 present.
Thank you for your excellent attendance as always. Now that we've established a physical quorum, our board secretary has received completed notice from Director Groven indicating that he cannot attend in
And
person.
Chairman, Director Pang is also
Pang,
remote.
okay, and also Sarah Pang. And pursuant to the Open Meetings Act, they're deemed admitted unless there's a motion against it. Seeing none, they may participate remotely. Thank you too. Item 3 is the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on September 12th of 2024. Any comments or corrections from what's been sent out to you? Seeing none, how about a motion and a second that we approve?
Motion.
Director Rotondo moves, seconded by Director Fuentes, that we approve these minutes. And Joey, let's take a quick roll call on approving the minutes from last month.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Aye.
Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Gathing? Director Gorman?
Aye.
Director Groven?
Aye.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin? Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Rotondo?
Aye.
Director Ross?
Yes.
Director Sager? Director Yonan? And Chairman Dillard.
Yes,
13 ayes.
and those minutes are approved. Thank you. Item 4 is the public comments segment of the meeting today. Any comments received will now be read into the record by the board secretary. Any written comments?
We have
There are
received no
none.
comments.
Is there anyone present that would like to speak in the public comment section? Seeing no one, we will move on to the executive director's report, which is item 5. Executive Director Leanne Redden, good morning.
Good morning, Chairman Dillard, board members and guests, those who are also tuning in and listening into our board meeting. I'm going to be fairly brief this morning because I'll be talking with you again as part of the legislative update that we'll talk through with staff in a few moments. But a few other quick updates. I do want to note that we now are fully in the midst of the budget season and have several dates to share with you so that you can participate and or stay informed as we go through that process. I do invite you and everyone to actually visit the transit funding section on our website and select the 2025 regional budget tab on that in that area, because it has all the information laid out in a very succinct and comprehensive way. You'll find the schedule of the 6 county board meetings where we and the service boards present the proposed 2025 budgets. You'll also find a link to register for our public hearing for the 2025 budget and capital program. It is a virtual hearing. We get better attendance when we do continue with the virtual hearings. And that will be held on Tuesday, December 3rd from 4 to 6 p.m. The hearing is open to the public, but you do have to actually just register so we can make sure you have that link to participate in that hearing. You'll also find in that section links to the service board budgets and information about their specific public hearings as well and their public comment periods. We will release the combined regional budget in November, which begins our formal comment period through before we get to the December meeting. So as we do each year, we'll be presenting the regional budget at 6 county boards throughout that make up our sort of our RTA region. The meetings begin with Cook County next week on October 23, followed by DuPage and Lake on November 12. McHenry on November 14, and Kane and Will on December 10. So as you can see, we've got some sort of double updates. So staff will be splitting up and sharing the responsibilities to cover all of those presentations around the region. At each of these, RTA staff from several departments will be there to both present and answer questions from county officials and members of the public. And as we've said before, we encourage you to participate in the appropriate hearing from the area you represent. And we encourage everyone to attend our November 22 board meeting, where you'll hear specifically from each of the service boards on the details of their budget for proposed budgets for 25. And it's a great opportunity for you to engage with them further and discuss and ask them specific questions that you might have on their budgets. And we'll be getting you a lot more information in advance of that board meeting. And then the whole budget season culminates with the December 19th meeting of this board, where you'll be asked to vote on the 2025 Regional Transit Operating Budget and Capital Program. I know many of you are familiar with the schedule, but I think it's just important to flag the dates, especially for those who might be listening, to also continue to look on our website for the details. A few other calendar items that I want to note for you. Next week on October 22, leaders from the service boards and I are scheduled to be on WTTW's Chicago Tonight to discuss the fiscal cliff, as the Senate Transportation Committee hearings have now wrapped up. I encourage you to tune in to that next week. But I also would encourage you to take a look at some of the recent reporting WTTW has done on this topic. It's been very thorough. I think we might have actually already shared the most recent article that they put together. On Thursday, October 24, we will also be hosting a summit on the future of suburban transit. Following the success of our safety summit that we held earlier this year, which focused on improving safety for riders and operators, we are now excited to host all 3 service boards as well as visitors from New Jersey Transit to discuss this, some of their very exciting plans for expansion and improvement in the suburbs, and then also incorporating the plans and ideas that PACE, Metra and CTA have for their specific ideas on suburban communities and how we can, if we achieve our funding solution with the state legislature, that they could begin to execute on some of those ideas. The summit will be held in Arlington Heights, and if you need any assistance in registering for that or any questions about the event and the location, just let Joey know and she can make sure that you have all the appropriate information. Finally, just a quick note, earlier this month, Rob Nash, our Director of Government Affairs, and Tina Fassett-Smith, our Director of Communications, all attended the American Public Transit Association annual conference in California. I also had the honor of being elected as APTA's Vice Chair. And we will all be able to gain, I think, some very valuable insights from the association, and more importantly from our peers as continuing to be part of that organization. Really, it's the relationships that we have and gain out of that association, and particularly our peers around the country, as we're all facing many of the same issues, whether it be fiscal cliffs, safety for passengers and operators, or the, need for a growing skilled workforce, and other challenges that we all share. This continues to benefit the RTA and our region, but it's really why we're committed to our continued roles in APTA, and I'm just excited to be able to sort of contribute to the leadership as we go forward. So next slide, please. Rob and I are going to discuss updates extensively in just a couple of minutes on our legislative strategy. But if anyone's been paying attention on the federal level, you may have noticed that President Biden signed a bipartisan continuing resolution that keeps the federal government funding in place through December 20. Congress returns post-election on November 12 for a lame duck session to continue negotiations on a 2025 spending bill. So next slide. So following the legislative report from the RTA and other presentations, you're going to hear a presentation on our 2025 budget, the RTA's budget, followed by a presentation about Transit is the Answer implementation, our strategic plan implementation and the work we're doing around that. And that will include a discussion of our 2025 legislative agenda, as I've noted. Then we're going to ask for a vote from you for the 2025 board meeting schedule, reappointment of 2 RTA pension trustees, and a contract for media strategy and purchasing, and then finally an approval of travel expense reimbursements. We are scheduled to do an executive session after the meeting, but it'll be short and we will be able to adjourn from that session. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back to you or answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Leanne? Going to hear from her and the staff extensively today. Thank you very much. Item 6A is the presentation and discussion of our own 2025 RTA agency budget. Nora, good morning, and Kevin, come on up.
Is this working? Yep. Okay. Good morning, Chairman Diller and members of the board. This is Kevin Bueso, CFO for the RTA. Today, to my right, we have Nora Buya, who's going to help me present the 2025 agency budget. The 2025 budget will represents about 2% of the overall regional budget. So you'll get to hear from the service boards next month, and they'll be presenting their budget. So again, 2% of that combined budget is what we're presenting today. This item is presented for informational purposes today. There's no action being requested. On December 19th at the board meeting this item again will be part of that regional budget where you will be asked to approve the budget and capital program. Before we get going on the budget itself, I'd just like to thank RTA budget staff, Nora, and as well as Sarah Rubino, who will be presenting later. They've worked very hard with the RTA managers to draft the budget and do all the detail day-to-day data entry that happens behind the scenes so that we can get this budget together. So again, thank you both of them along with the RTA department heads. If we can move on to the next slide. So before we get into the details or we dive into the numbers, I'll just bear with me a few seconds here or maybe a minute or two as I go into the details of some of the primary initiatives that are included in the 2025 RTA agency budget. So this RTA 2025 budget remains rooted in the vision and principles of Transit is the Answer, a strategic plan. We are working towards a safe, reliable, accessible public transportation that connects people to opportunity, advances equity, and combats climate change. In 2025, we'll focus working on legislators and partners towards finding a sustainable funding solution while supporting the service board as they continue to improve services and increase ridership. To that end, the 2025 RTA agency budget will support efforts to increase transit ridership through several reduced fare and transit advocacy programs, improve transit access, and more robust information technology. As you may recall, in 2024, the Access Pilot Program was launched. for individuals experiencing lower income who are enrolling in what's commonly known as a SNAP or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This program is supported by Cook County, so Metro gets reimbursed for most of the lost fare revenue. However, this program will end July 2025. There's likely going to be opportunities for us to expand access programs system-wide, as well as the expansion of the ride-free program for ADA paratransit customers on a fixed route. In 2025, there is going to be some changes in terms of the funding engineering construction projects for access to transit. This is happening within the planning department. And the change will be using RTA and local match funds as opposed to federal funds. These can move projects quicker, and also it will require our more staff time on our planning department, but it will result in quicker results for project partners. The RTA staff will also procure a consultant to assist with updating the HSTP program, so Human Services Transportation Program. This is a requirement to receive Section 5310 funding. The scope of work will include a demographic analysis and assessment, as well as an inventory and assessment of existing transportation providers. This project is expected to be completed in 2026. The Transit is the Answer strategic plan implementation will continue in 2025, and it will be managed in parallel with transit advocacy campaign. The communications department will lead message development, design, and engagement planning. This project will also create creative deliverables to be used in campaigns for various transit products and programs, including the new regional day pass, potentially expanded access programs as well. Finally, the RTA's information technology, so internal only, this program doesn't include service boards technology, just the RTA. So IT will continue to implement a comprehensive multi-layer disaster recovery program, which, as a reminder, was approved by the board this year, as well as any other software and infrastructure improvements. With these, again, just highlighting some of the items that are included, or some of the key initiatives are included in the 2025 agency budget. I'll now hand it off to Nora, who will go through the numbers, and then we'll open it up for questions. If we can go to the next slide, please.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, board members. The 2025 agency budgeted funding and revenue total $56 million. Of that amount, 72% or $40 million represent regional public funding from the RTA sales tax, 28% or $16 million are federal grants, and 0.2% or $0.1 million represent other revenue, mainly from the Transit Benefit Program. Next slide, please. The total budgeted agency expenses also totals $56 million. Administrative costs account for 35% or $19.5 million of agency expenses. The administrative budget includes expenses for personnel, professional services, information technology, facilities, and office services that support the funding, planning, and oversight mission of the RTA. The regional programs budget accounts for the remaining 65% or $36.5 million of agency expenses. Regional programs include services that the RTA provides directly to the public at 33% or $18 million, as well as grant and RTA funding project at 32% or also $18 million. RTA regional services include ADA certification, mobility management services, travel information, customer service, and the reduced fare and transit benefit programs. Next slide, please. This chart shows the portion of the 2025 proposed agency budget supported by regional funding from the RTA sales tax of $40.4 million. The 2025 administrative budget of $19.5 million increases by 8%, due mostly to increased IT expenses and increased personnel expenses. The proposed 2025 RTA agency administrative budget falls 45% below the administrative cap of $35 million as set by the RTA Act. The 2025 regional programs budget increases slightly by 2%. It includes initiatives such as continuing to advance Transit is the Answer strategic plan, new community planning project, joint development research, the new customer satisfaction survey, access to transit project, continued regional transit advocacy, and Rebuild Illinois project management oversight. It also includes the potential expansion of the Access Pilot Program and increased expenses for the ADA Paratransit Certification Program. Total agency headcount is budgeted at 109 positions. It is the same as in the 2024 budget. In summary, the total funding for the RTA 2025 agency budget increases from the 2024 adopted budget by $1.9 million or 5% to $40.4 million. This amount accounts less than 2% of the total 2025 regional funding for transit operations. That concludes our presentation. We would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, Director Gorman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, Nora and Kevin, for the presentation. So the increase in the administrative was for IT and personnel expense, but yet the full-time, the FTEs, the 109 positions still remain the same? So is that just like a natural growth or increase in expenses for the employees?
The main reason for the administrative expenses are, as I mentioned, the IT technology, cybersecurity, software subscription. We are on cloud-based and all the software is increasing. And personnel expenses, we have a slight increase in salaries for the employees.
Yeah, and at FTE, so number of positions remains the same. As I'm sure you've experienced through any sector, inflation in salaries it's a real thing, and so we're having to step it up as well.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Lewis.
I just want to make sure I understood what you said. I think the budget totals for both 24 and 25 were less than what was calculated under the RTA Act. Was that a proper statement?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so really it would have been not appropriate, it would have been possible to spend more had the funding been there based on the act. Is that the correct?
Correct.
Well,
Technically, kind of
Correct.
correct, yes, but we have never, I mean, that's where the state statute, when they created the governance structure that we have today, they set up a limit as to how much sort of the administration agency, the RTA, could spend. We have never come anywhere near that cap. And as Nora's point was, we are 44% under what we could legally spend. Now, we've never even anticipated ever coming kind of anywhere close to that. I think it's just an important marker just to sort of show that we've stayed lean and mean, and we're not just going to spend money for the sake of spending money either.
I agree. I think it also is a testament to efficiency and discipline and good management. So that was what I was trying to.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
correct.
thank you. Yep.
Dr. Yonan.
And just kind of, building upon that, on the regional programs, you broke down what the regional services were. What are some examples of the regional programs? Because, to Director Lewis's point that the opportunity, to maybe do more, I think is out there, right? I understand that we haven't, come close to that upper limit, but what are some examples of the regional programs that could be listed there?
Yeah, I already mentioned a few. So these are the RTA and the federal grants related project. The biggest item is the Transit is the Answer a strategic plan related ongoing project and related transit advocacy campaign project, access to transit project, new community planning project, joint development research, new customer satisfaction survey, Rebuild Illinois. These are the major ones that is in the budget.
but again, I think the opportunity here and maybe there to grow the program is there then, right? If there could be some other partnerships with other agencies to
That is
increase
correct.
this. Okay,
Yes,
that-
yes,
Just for my
correct,
edification. Thank you.
correct.
And
Thank you.
just to add to that, there, as you may know, or as you may recall, our funding for the RTA agency comes from the top, right, comes off the top of the revenues that come into the system. So there is such opportunities. It's just more, again, in partnership with the service boards, that could be more. So your point is well taken, yeah.
Any other questions or comments? And again, we don't finally approve this until December. So Nora and Leanne and Kevin are always available to answer questions. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's move on to item 6B. Hirsch is going to come up and can introduce anybody else that will speak as well. For our transit is the answer update. Hey, Sarah, here comes Rob.
Good morning.
Morning.
Am I on? Okay. Thank you, Chairman Dillard and directors for having me here today. I'm Hirsch Singh. I'm a principal analyst with the Data Services Group in Planning. As always, there are a number of staff up here with me today that will contribute to the Transit is the Answer update. I will allow each to introduce themselves as we go. Next slide, please. First item is a project update, and I'm here to briefly demo the relaunch of the RTA dashboards. Staff is proud to announce the launch of the Chicago Region Transit Dashboard. This website consolidates the RTA's multiple dashboard products into one centralized location that can be accessed at rtachicago.org/dashboards. This new website further positions the RTA as the region's transit data hub, providing statistics on rider demographics, ridership, service, capital, finance, and performance metrics. Today, I'll provide a brief overview of each content area. As you can see, the homepage contains demographics such as population, jobs, and transit commute mode share. The selector tool can be used to view results by service board. Demographics shown are for the populations living near transit, using buffers of rail stations and bus stops. For example, all PACE statistics are shown by buffering each PACE bus stop by 1/2 mile. We feel this is a novel approach to calculating these statistics compared to previous methods, such as reporting totals by county or for the region. Also shown are service statistics such as the number of lines and routes, stations and stops, and route miles. This data will be updated quarterly or as new data becomes available. Next, we'll visit the ridership page. The ridership page reports system-wide ridership by month for the current year and prior 2 years. Ridership mode share is shown in the pie chart below, which contains ridership totals by mode for the most current month. For example, as you can see, CTA bus comprises 48% of the current ridership in the system, totaling 15.5 million rides for the month of August. We are pleased to note that we are now also reporting paratransit services with a separate tab that breaks out the totals for each of these specialized services. For example, ADA paratransit comprises 65% of the total paratransit services in the region, with Taxi Access Program or TAP following at 17%. Lastly, we also continue to track pandemic ridership recovery compared to our peers. Detailed definitions of our peer agencies can be found below, as well as a link to more detailed ridership information. Next, we'll visit the service page. The service page mirrors the same format as the ridership page, but shows supply levels. The first chart displays system-wide service miles by month for the current year and prior 2 years. Service miles by mode is also shown in the pie chart, which displays the totals by mode for the most current month, which is August. Like that of the ridership page, paratransit service miles are also being shown here. For example, ADA paratransit comprises 83% of total paratransit services, totaling nearly 2.4 million miles in the month of August. Lastly, we are also continuing to track pandemic service level recovery compared to our peers. And again, detailed definitions of our peer agencies can be found by scrolling below. Next, we'll highlight the capital page. The capital page shows 10 years worth of capital program amounts, 5 prior years, the current year, and 4 out years. Each bar is color-coded to show local, state, and federal amounts that make up the total program. This panel is updated after a capital amendment is passed at a board meeting. The key capital projects table shows active projects in the current capital program totaling greater than 15 million. You can click on a hyperlink to RTAMs to view project descriptions, maps, and project evaluations for these projects. The capital expenditure panel shows actual expenditures for 2 prior years, and the most current data point shows the year-to-date expenditures. Year-to-date figures are updated as data becomes available. The most right column contains 3 pie charts. As you know, the capital group developed 15 metrics to evaluate how capital project impact regional goals. Each year, over 200 capital projects are evaluated as part of the budget process. These pie charts show results for 3 of those 15 metrics for the 2024 capital program. These charts will be updated in December to reflect evaluations of projects in the 2025 capital program. By scrolling down, you can access a map showing where the capital projects are occurring through the region. You can also click on any point or line on the map to see more information with links to the individual project pages on our RTAM's website. For both of the dashboards, the map and the dashboard above, system-wide results are shown on this page by default, but you can use the selector tool at the top to view results by individual service board. Next, we'll head over to the finance page. This page has remained largely untouched from its initial release in April 2022. Budgeted performance in 6 key areas is shown by the gray bars, and actual performance for the current year is shown by the orange line. Each panel has a year-to-date tab that shows a cumulative nominal result for each metric, the percent year-to-date variance from budget, and a definition of each metric. The summary of financial results has also been added below, which was previously a link to a separate PDF. This provides explanatory context for the results displayed in these dashboard panels. And again, just like the previous page, system-wide results are shown on this page by default, but you can use the selector tool at the top to show results by service board. Lastly, we'll visit the performance page. This page contains selected performance metrics identified in the latest strategic plan, Transit is the Answer. This page displays results from 2019 to reflect the full impact of the pandemic and ongoing recovery. Whole year data is shown through 2023. 2024 data is shown year to date and is updated monthly as data becomes available. Customer satisfaction data comes from our quarterly panel survey that goes out to roughly 2,000 riders who have opted in for ongoing research. And again, system-wide results are being shown on this page, but you can use the selector tool at the top to show results by service board. Since May of 2020, we have created a progression of dashboards. They are dynamic and evolve over time to reflect current interests and to improve the user experience. This assembly of content is the most thorough, cohesive set that we have completed. We are excited to keep the content dynamic and to reflect the work the RTA is doing throughout the region. We welcome feedback and comments at any time. That concludes my presentation, and I'll pause for any questions or comments.
Any questions or comments here? Yes, Director Colson.
Can you explain to me, how does Metro measure its ridership? I mean, it's pretty chaotic this morning on my Metro train, and I couldn't tell you how many people were there.
Yeah, the ridership statistics that we are reporting on this dashboard is what is reported to the NTD, the National Transit Database. As far as how the counts are being done, I can get you more information on that. I don't know specifically. Right. We can definitely follow up with some more information on that.
Metro now gets a lot of the information through the app, because I think what Jim was saying, 80%, more than 80% of the riders actually use the app. So when you click your ticket for your app that day, that's counted as your, if you've got a day pass, that's the 2 trips. So they do that, they do it through a lot of the digital data they get as well, but then surveys and then conductor counts.
First, I'd like to see that too. So
Sure. Yeah, we'll definitely follow up.
it's probably more accurate bill today than it has been, even though they're still doing cash on the trains, just through the machines and Ventra apps, and conductor counts. Those guys, the conductors have to account for whatever cash tickets there are.
Yeah, as Leanne mentioned previously, the data we were getting was boarding and alighting surveys that were completed every roughly 2 to 4 years. But now, from my understanding, it's a kind of a combined from various surveying and the actual ticketing, so.
Any other questions of Hirsch? Dr. Sager?
Thanks, Chairman. With regards to the surveys, satisfaction surveys that are done, you indicated, I think, that you have 2,000 individuals that are enrolled in that program. Is that correct?
Yes,
That survey? And how often are they providing input?
the panel surveys are being completed, I think, on an annual basis, from my understanding. But again, I can get you more information on that was a panel survey of consistent base of riders that we're longitudinally surveying, just so we can actually have the same survey sample. But as far as how often that's completed, I don't recall. I know we're in the process of doing one right now, actually.
Yeah, we actually update them and check in with that group on a quarterly basis.
Okay.
And then the surveys are also supplemented by bigger annual or multi-year kind of surveys that we do in partnership with the 3 service boards as well. So that's more the labor intensive, actual surveying, but we do quarterly on that panel.
And do we have summaries of that survey that are available for us to take a look at? Is that on the dashboard, the summary of those surveys?
That is not on the dashboard, no.
But we can get that for you. I mean, the data is sort of rolls up and influences information in terms of sort of the scoring on the satisfaction survey results, but we can get you more detail on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hirsch, yesterday I saw an analysis done by one researcher, and today there's a poll in the Chicago Tribune. You don't have to give it to me now, but if I'm asked every day, every weekday, on average, 365 days a year, how many riders do you think are on our 3 service board system? Will you get me that number as to what you think it is? There's always discrepancies, but I just love I gotta have a number when I'm asked by people, how many people do you move a day on a weekday?
Sure.
And it was interesting because the one that's in the survey in the paper today and the one that was on the website yesterday, they're different. So just give me a number that you're comfortable I can use, that Leanne will let me use. And
Well, I know we say on a regular basis, we provide on average, 1.2 million trips per day. And the sort of working assumption is a trip is usually, one person makes probably 2 trips, maybe a few more. But, so that's sort of the number that we use as the rule of thumb for the ridership that we're experiencing. But I will note too, that ridership continues, as we tell you often, is continuing to grow post-pandemic. It is not back to pre-pandemic levels, but it is, a significant number. And the point being, it's also less about the actual how many humans are on the system on a regular basis. It's 1.2 million trips on a daily basis. And as I always remind people, that's 1.2 million trips that aren't happening in a car in front of you if you're not on the bus or the train. Less congestion, better for the environment, all of those things. But we'll get you more of a detailed breakdown.
And it still is a mind-boggling statistic. If you say we move more than 1 million riders a day, that's a number that blows most people's minds. Any other questions? Who's next? Sarah?
Thanks, Hirsch, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Directors. I'm Sarah Rubino, Principal Analyst in the Budget Division. This will be a brief update on the service board financial results now for the year-to-date through August. Next slide, please. Favorable results continued through August for CTA, Metra, and Pace Suburban Service, while ADA Paratransit reported an unfavorable result as ridership and purchase transportation expense have exceeded budget. If this trend continues for ADA, additional funding could be needed for 2024. This would be addressed toward the year end by utilizing the ADA Paratransit Reserve Fund, subject to board approval. Pace Suburban Service continues to experience very favorable results versus budget. Despite extensive recruiting efforts, Pace's headcount remains about 272 full-time equivalents, or 14.6% below budgeted levels. This in turn has led to lower than budgeted labor expense, while fuel, insurance, and other expense categories have also been favorable. At the same time, Pace's ridership has exceeded expectation, producing fair revenue, which also contributes to their favorable operating deficit. With Pace's recent additions to service levels, we do still expect expenses to increase and the operating deficit variance to decrease in the second half of the year. The 7.7% favorable variance for the region equates to about $148 million of favorable variance from the adopted 2024 budget. Next slide, please. Since our last update in August, the service boards have requisitioned an additional $99 million of relief funding. And as a region, we've now drawn down 68% of the $3.5 billion total. The current budget and two-year plan project that the service board's federal COVID relief funding would begin to exhaust in late 2025, followed by the estimated annual operating shortfall of over $700 million, which we've been communicating. That's it for me. I'll pause here for any questions before turning it over to Rob.
Good morning. I'm Rob Nash, Director of Government Affairs. Our team has had a busy month as we continue to meet with lawmakers and stakeholders to prepare for the critical 2025 legislative session. This includes meetings with the governor's office, legislative leaders in both houses of the General Assembly, and one-on-one meetings with individual lawmakers. We've also been engaging with both legislative committees tasked with tackling transit funding issues. In the Senate Transportation Committee, and then the Public Transit Working Group in the House. As you've heard, Chairman Dillard and Leanne have testified and answered questions at all 5 public hearings hosted by the Senate Transportation Committee in our region. The last Senate hearing was Tuesday in Springfield, and we are preparing to brief the House Working Group later this month. Looking ahead to some of the key dates, Election Day is November 5th, if you had not heard that. The veto session is currently scheduled for November 12th through the 14th and the 19th through the 21st, although this schedule could change with the expectation that some of these dates could be canceled. Veto session will be a good opportunity to continue to talk with members about funding and reform, but at this point, we do not expect transit legislation to move in November. We are gearing up for potential progress in the January lame duck session, and then, of course, next spring, which that legislative session runs through May 31st is scheduled to run through May 31st of 2025. That does not mean they could not go over. Next slide, please. As we work towards advancing transit funding legislation in Illinois, we continue to monitor and analyze action in some of our peer states and peer systems. There are several regions that have faced their fiscal cliffs sooner than we will. And so we're learning how their legislatures are responding to potential service cuts and fare increases as those cliffs are experienced. The scope and structure of funding packages varies in these different regions, and the level of action does matter for the long-term prospects of these systems. Some states have provided limited one-time funding to avoid cuts for now, but not address the long-term structural problem facing their systems. For example, California's plan relies on temporarily flexing capital dollars for operations. And in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia's SEPTA system received only enough funding to fill about 20% of their projected $240 million annual deficit. Now they're planning for fare increases and service cuts in the region. New York and New Jersey took more substantial action, but transit agencies in those states will still need to come back to their legislatures within the next 3 to 5 years, if not sooner, depending on economic conditions. The most comprehensive transit funding package passed in Minnesota in 2023, creating a new regional transportation sales tax and new retail delivery fee, which combined are projected to raise as much as $700 million annually for capital and operations. They do mix their funding streams in this scenario, allowing for service expansion in the region. Next slide, please. As we prepare for the session in 2025, we're also taking a look back at past transit crises that we've experienced in Illinois and highlighting important lessons learned from those situations. Chronic underfunding has led to multiple periods of funding changes and reform since the RTA was established in 1974. In 2008, the RTA, the service boards, and partners from across the region successfully lobbied the General Assembly for a 0.25% increase in the RTA sales tax in Cook and the Collier counties. The new revenue was intended to shore up the system's finances and support critical mainline and paratransit services and avoid major fare increases and planned service cuts, similar to what we're facing today. But ultimately, in the wake of the great financial crisis, the funding sources provided proved not resilient enough to support the bus and train service the region needs. To achieve sustainable operating funding, we believe we must identify stable, durable, and diverse sources that are expected to grow over time. Funding sources need to be diverse to protect the operating budget from inevitable shifts in the economy, especially revenue sources that are extremely sensitive to consumer activity. We expect the RTA sales tax and the associated state match will remain key sources of operating funding, but riders would benefit from those sources being supplemented by additional revenue streams. Sources that could incentivize transit use and reduce emissions, like road usage charges, carry additional benefits, and we hope they're considered in the General Assembly's discussions. On the reform side, we learned it's essential that governance reflects the diversity of the region. In 2008, seats were added to the boards of the RTA and the service boards based on population shifts in the region and funding sources. And we expect that could happen again this time. Legislators are also considered granting RTA new levels of responsibility for key regional planning and service functions. If this happens, the legislature must grant RTA clear authority and mechanisms to enforce any new responsibilities. And put that another way, we are eager to take on additional accountability and responsibility, but we need the ability to effectuate those changes in order to deliver on those promises made to both the riders and the General Assembly. The 2008 legislation lacked detail in implementing and enforcing some of these new powers, simply pointing to the development of the strategic plan every 5 years as the main tool to impose progress on the system and achieve system goals. More clarity on that authority is needed as we approach the General Assembly in 2025. Next slide, please. One of the most important lessons learned from past crises is that the legislature must act well in advance of the fiscal cliff. If the General Assembly doesn't act on the cliff in 2025, next spring, the system will be required to prepare for service cuts that will negatively impact the system and riders. Agencies are required by federal law to conduct public hearings and equity analysis before significant service cuts are imposed. So if a solution is not reached in May of 2025, we will need to immediately prepare for a 20% cut to the regional operating budget, which means service cuts of up to 40%. I want to dwell there for a moment. A 20% operating budget gap does not mean we simply shave service hours or coverage. It means a significant 40% drop in service levels across the system. All the efforts of the planners within the service boards who are right now planning for expansion of the PACE Pulse system or implementation of CTA's Better Streets for Buses plan, or the transition to regional rail at Metra and other popular initiatives would have to stop so that everyone could begin transition to planning for service cuts and fare increases. It's also important to keep in mind that it takes time for tax revenue to get to the service boards and fund bus and train operations. Today, RTA sales tax revenue takes at least 3 months to make it to the service boards. The state's matching funds follow a similar timeline. So any increased taxes will take a minimum of 3 to 6 months from consumer transaction to distribution to the transit agencies, and new taxes would likely take longer. The RTA Act does not allow for short-term borrowing at the levels needed to delay these cuts and layoffs if we do confront that lag. Next slide, please. Our team used analysis like this in our ongoing conversations with lawmakers and stakeholders to develop our 2025 state legislative agenda, which was shared with you in advance of today's meeting. Much of the agenda is carried over from 2024 as it focuses on funding, but I'll pass it over to Leanne to talk through some of the highlights and what's new in this year's legislative agenda draft.
So thanks, Rob. I think as we've told you many times, we're not just advocating to fill the shortfall. We're actually advocating to add more monies to the region to support the things we've talked a lot about, some of the expansions that PACE is looking at doing, that Metro converting to regional rail and providing more services that, the public and taxpayers are actually largely asking for. So that number that we're, advocating for is at least 1.5 billion to support service expansion across the region. But we're also looking at eliminating this state mandated 50% fare box recovery ratio and fully funding ADA paratransit services and the free and reduced ride programs. These are services that we have to provide and they are significantly underfunded. The state is not sort of funding those programs to that full letter. The 400 million needed in new funds would cover the cost of existing and mandated programs, but could allow freeing up resources to support, more frequent, more reliable service across the fixed route system. So funding those free and reduced and paratransit services really would allow us to sort of move monies over to provide some of those additional services. In addition to these funding priorities, the 2025 agenda again calls for the state to reform how it evaluates transportation projects with a focus on reducing emissions, advancing racial equity. And for decades, I think many of you know this too, but many of the roadway projects that have occurred in our region have harmed communities and in some respects even limited transit's growth potential. So sort of thinking through more holistically how we're supporting and funding not just transit projects, but the investments on the road and the highway side as well. So next slide, please. This year, in this 2025 legislative agenda, we've added a new set of priorities for advancing a multi-layered approach to safety and security, as was discussed at length during our safety summit that we held earlier this year. I think we've noted this with you before, but rates of violent crime occurring on buses and trains are decreasing, but there is much more work that really needs to be done to reduce crime and to improve people's perception of safety on public transit. So we're calling for the state to partner with local and county officials to increase the presence of law enforcement personnel, as well as the presence of social services across the entire system. Riders have been clear in that they want to see more police and more support services at rail stations, bus stops, and on transit vehicles. So next slide, please. One of the biggest changes to the legislative agenda are in what we're titling the reform section, where we've added some more detail based on our discussions with you, with state lawmakers and riders and regional stakeholders. So the RTA is advocating for new operations funding to come with reforms that would establish a stronger RTA that directly interacts with riders to address their day-to-day issues. So specifically, we're proposing that a strengthened RTA has more authority over service, fare policy, and capital prioritization. These are areas featured in the RTA's Transit is the Answer strategic plan, as well as in CMAP's plan for action for regional transit. So these are things that people have told us about as well, not just things that we kind of as staff sort of dreamt up. A stronger RTA, for example, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea what we're talking about within those three buckets, right? A stronger RTA could serve as a rider hub for fares and customer service at the regional level, ensuring that all riders have access to a simple and easy to understand fares and fare programs. The RTA is really well positioned for this role, really given our responsibility overseeing many regional services, but also the regional operating budget, where fares are a critical component to how we put those budgets together. The legislature could also direct a strengthened RTA to set regional service standards with policies and mechanisms in place to both monitor and enforce compliance. The RTA could use a regional lens to evaluate existing transit services and identify areas where improvement is needed, allowing everyone in the region to better understand the frequency and scope of transit services that would really be available in their communities. So it wouldn't be one size fits all, but being sort of more specific but more discrete about what kind of services people could expect in their communities. Leaders from each of the service boards would present quarterly under this scenario to the RTA board with updates on service delivery, service coordination, and how they are meeting the region's agreed upon service standards, with the RTA board having the ability to monitor and enforce compliance on an ongoing basis. In addition, the legislature could empower the RTA with greater responsibility for regional planning and capital prioritization. The RTA can monitor the state of good repair of transit assets system-wide as a combined portfolio and track regional investment needs. The RTA can partner with service boards and roadway agencies to lead planning of major regional transit and transportation projects, including roadways with potential for increased transit use. This is sort of the proposal as we've kind of laid it out now, hearing from both the legislature, advocates, and riders as to, what a scenario could look like with a strengthened RTA. So though we do expect this as we go through the rest of our legislative conversations and conversations with the General Assembly, we do expect it to evolve. We welcome input from you as well as we continue those conversations, as you have conversations with, in your local areas, as well as with elected officials and the public, and really provide us that input so we can continue to evolve and really put forward a proposal that makes most sense for the region, that ultimately, hopefully, is, coupling significant funding improvements with some reform agenda for the transit system. So with that, I will pause, and any questions or comments from you on any of the stuff that Rob and I just went through.
Questions, comments? Yes, Michael Lewis, Director Lewis.
Thank you for that presentation. First of all, it's very comprehensive and very helpful. I just had two questions. One, on the enforcement issue, one of the issues from the RTA's perspective is that sometimes lots of responsibility, but the ability to really affect change or require actions is a challenge. So what's envisioned in terms of the enforcement element of the reform?
I'll start. Rob can jump in. I think that some of that is sort of part of the evolving conversation, but I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. We talk about this a lot. A lot of times you really only get to sort of check in and really talk to and engage with the service boards almost at the end of the sort of a lot of the conversations, right? So they come in and present to you in November, and then you're asked to approve the budget in December. As you probably remember, we actually asked them to come in and give you kind of a little state of play a few months earlier. That kind of thing is one small step that could happen. But like I noted, we would envision under a stronger requirement that they have to come in on a quarterly basis. But as part of the budget process, we would, and not just RTA in its own vacuum, but working with the service boards, define on the service standards, using the service standards example, right? Help define what those service standards might look like in a downtown urban bus network in terms of headway, how often, how frequent a bus comes along, how long of the hours of service that service would be provided, where might better services be needed, more frequency of service be needed in a suburban area versus more of a rural area. And so everyone has kind of an understanding of sort of the state of play of what the expectations are, and then funding would be allocated accordingly to that. But then if you were having them come in on a quarterly basis, and as we do quarterly financials, give you the opportunity to hear from them specifically as to how they are meeting those standards and those funds that are being tied to that provision of service that they're providing. That's just an example of how that could play out. But I think Rob noted on it too, that I think it's very important that the RTA Act and any amendments to the RTA Act get very specific as to sort of not just expectations as to what people are supposed to do, but have, potentially consequences that could be a little more discreet and useful along the way to kind of support, I think, the vision that we and the service boards see for the transit system for our region. Rob, do you want to add anything?
No, you pretty much just one item, or two maybe. It's sort of wonky, but process really does determine outcomes a lot of the time. And while it may sound sort of, again, Robert's Rules of Order, having the multiple opportunities throughout the year to weigh in on policy development at the service boards is an important innovation, believe it or not, because we do sort of have this all or nothing shot at the end of the year on the budget. So that's an important nuance that I think a lot of advocates don't understand. And as just a point of information for everyone, the RTA Act certainly does influence how we operate on a significant basis, but everyone needs to remember there are discrete legislative acts or statutory acts that cover the CTA, Metro, and PACE as well. And that's where those conflicts need to be sort of harmonized, because, laying out this expectation in one component of that and not changing the power to effectuate policy change in another, that's where some of that lack of accountability can creep into the conversation. And so that's in large part what we're trying to clear up. We are eager to step up and take on additional responsibility and be the accountable agency, but we need to have the tools in the toolbox to deliver on what's expected of us. And so you can't really have one without the other. And that would be the main thrust, I think, of the specific policy conversation we want to have with lawmakers.
Rob, I think you hit on the key point, the harmonization between the not punitive, I don't want to say punitive, but some measure of if you don't adhere to the standard, there has to be a consequence, and that consequence has to be enforceable. So that was, I guess, the point that I was trying to get at, and it sounds like that's being envisioned and what's being discussed. Because without it, then it's just it's a conversation, but it has no consequence.
Yeah, and I think consequences is one term, but I think we're also trying to prevent any of those issues reaching a point of that sort of standoff. We want to collaboratively work toward a policy on a multi-step process so that we don't have to have these sort of all or nothing conversations, as the budget process unfolds.
Okay. Thank you. My second and final question, Lan, was going to be, we talk a lot about talking to the General Assembly. Where's the governor stand on these matters? Is there conversations, or has he weighed in or had a view on what we're talking about relative to this process?
And the chairman can certainly weigh in on his conversations with the governor, both at least public and private. I don't know how much you'd like to reveal, but they've been very consistent. His conversations and points made in public have been, I'd like to hear feedback from both the service boards and the RTA and how they think the system can be improved. We have walked the governor's staff through some of our thoughts, essentially similar information than you received today. But I do think, in my observation of the governor's term, he I think, is focused on allowing the General Assembly to come up with at least some measure of a consensus, and I'm assuming will weigh in as that emerges in the legislative process. I think he takes that seriously. Like let the different constituencies sort of hash it out in the legislature, and then we'll come together as we're closer to a final proposal.
Dr. Gorman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate Director Lewis discussing this, because that's kind of where I was heading. So the enforcement and then the implementation too of the initial, thoughts. But obviously, to build upon this as well, I would think that these are not just the firm 3 points to be discussed, but I'm sure, as you mentioned, other points for discussion as well. So that brings me to just a discussion that Rob had mentioned about the level of actions, from our peer agencies. Now, Minnesota, they have, you mentioned, for their sustainable revenue, that's probably the most comprehensive transit agency right now, as far as, what they're doing to their coverage. Do you mind reiterating what you mentioned? You said it was to get to that point, there's an increase in sales tax, and what was the other?
There was an increase in the sales tax. And before I finish on Minnesota, just to touch on, for example, New York, it was a significant funding package, over $1 billion, but it involved a significant new tax on essentially a business payroll tax, and some other steps that they're going to take, and they're still probably not out of the woods yet. So again, the scope of these challenges is significant. On the Minnesota example, the main new revenue was retail delivery fee. And so as you've probably seen in your neighborhood, multiple deliveries to folks' homes, whether it's food or products and or other items. And I think the theory that the Minnesota legislature took to that was contributing to traffic congestion, contributing to emissions. And if we can help incentivize people to get on transit to reduce both of those by placing a fee on those deliveries, it's a progressive way to get money into the system. And so they'll generate, they think, upwards of $200 million over the next 4 years for the transit system specifically. Transit is sharing that money with some other entities in Minnesota, but essentially similar to what our approach is, like there's obviously we need funding that's sufficient and durable, but another consideration is how do we incentivize people to get on the system? And if people choose not to, okay, well then that's a choice they've made, and how do we structure our revenue system to support transit through that activity?
Can I say just a point of clarification? The Minnesota thing, they've made their legislature acted to make permanent changes, and they have been fully voted on and being executed. The nuance on sort of the New Jersey and New York area is that they're still trying to implement some of those things. To Rob's point about they're not fully out of the woods. So while they've said they're going to do certain things, they haven't actually sort of, some of the political players sort of maybe presenting some challenges for them in that space. And SEPTA on the Philadelphia side has, they thought they had a package, and then sort of the 11th hour, the legislature sort of changed the proposal and sort of pulled the rug out from under them, if you will. And that sort of literally made them do overnight an about face to a sort of a 9 to 10 month process of, instead of thinking we've got a game plan on how we move forward, to how do we spend the next 9 to 10 months publicly, as required by federal law, doing all the analysis and planning for service cuts and massive fare increases. So it's kind of a complete about face of what they're doing. So I just think we just wanted to make sure that you also had that sense. California is another example of, they've just made a short-term fix and they're going to have to come back. So I just think it's important to understand some of those contexts and nuances.
New York's interesting. They had a congestion tax ready to go. Spent hundreds of millions of dollars planning how they were going to implement that congestion tax. And they put that one on hold. The other thing they did in New York, and I'm not espousing this at all for Chicago, is they assigned the new National Guard to the subway system in New York for security purposes. That's a major policy shift. So we'll watch New York, but essentially New York did $1 billion. And they realized there's a big fiscal cliff in New York.
Thank you. I'm just an idea. I mean, just with all these different ideas, obviously, we're, just kind of throwing different ideas and suggestions out there. If, maybe we could, put it on the table, maybe what's California's issue, what's their deficit, and then a potential solution, one they're using, ideas that they didn't use, maybe for each of these different transits, to just try to, just get our, just some ideas out there, and our, ideas for us that, we can, maybe look to do and get our wheels spinning too.
We would be happy to share with the board. We have a sort of breakdown on what each of those systems has both confronted and how they, at least to this point, have addressed it, including there were commitments that New Jersey Transit needed to make, for example, on fare increases. So we can give you a breakdown of how the state of play is for, I think it's about a dozen agencies or so.
That'd be helpful. Thanks so much, Rob.
Yeah.
Dr. Sager.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to be respectful of time here, but 3 points quickly. The first is I thank colleagues Lewis and Gorman for bringing forth this issue of enforcing compliance. I think certainly we all know that we have the financial leverage, if you will, but it's must be more than that. I mean, it has to be developed more, and I think we've already had that conversation, and I appreciate it, but I think that that's something that we as a board need to be fully engaged in developing. The second point is really going back to a question associated with increasing social service presence. Can you identify that a little bit more specifically? What are we saying specifically, practically with regards to support services?
Yeah, drug intervention programs. So I'll back up for a second. CTA has already got several pilot programs going on out there where they have homeless advocates, mental health advocates, and social service organizations engaged in sort of these spot groups that go out and intervene in circumstances. Many of the safety and security issues on the public transit system aren't necessarily sort of violent crime. It's challenges around some of these broader societal issues that we're all seeing, you know, in not just on the transit system, but in our communities at large. And so the goal would be to actually have more funding available to not just have those as small sort of spot pilot programs, but have them more as a comprehensive program that could be right-sized and deployed across the transit network, not just on CTA, but even on PACE and Metra as needed. So that sort of thinking more holistically and more comprehensively, so it's not just a public police enforcement issue. It's more about trying to address what are some of the root causes of some of the challenges and the things that we're seeing.
I appreciate that. I do think that we're finding throughout the suburban area, if you will, that it is more than just law enforcement. It is provision of social services to try to address directly some of the root causes of some challenges that we've all experienced. So I appreciate that. The last thing I just had a question about quickly was, can you give me, Rob, or us an update quickly upon where do we think we stand in terms of the road usage fee context or concept?
I don't, I think it's pretty clear that the revenue discussion has been lagging the conversation around both goals for service improvement and some of the reforms that we've talked about. And while those conversations, I think, have been happening a little bit more behind closed doors with lawmakers internally, that conversation has to come to the forefront. None of this really matters, essentially, if you have to shrink the system by 40%. I mean, of course, we can make improvements, but no one wants to talk about a well-run system that's nearly half as small as it is today, right? So we have to get to the funding conversation. To be 100% honest, I think a lot of people are interested in having that conversation on November 6th as opposed to November 5th or earlier. There's been a hope that begins again in earnest as the General Assembly comes back into session. But I think we've already seen people sort of developing their, lists of items that the General Assembly needs to address. And there are a number of funding challenges on that list, and we are clearly one of those. So the conversation does have to shift to the revenue side of things. We remain agnostic, meaning the RTA remains agnostic as to the funding sources. If you ask, we are always trying to position ourselves as a resource, almost an extension of the staff for the General Assembly. And if they have asked us to run scenarios, they have asked CMAP to run scenarios, they've asked us to do analysis and offer some thoughts on what type of revenue might produce what type of resources for the system. But frankly, they are the ones that have to vote on the proposals, and whatever they think they can put together a roll call to support, as long as some of the principles we have, which are a diverse set of sources that are durable, predictable, stable, and if you really ask us for opinion, incentivize people to use the system. We think those are good principles to pursue, but there have not been, I don't think, specific menus of revenues circulated among lawmakers at this point.
I appreciate that, and I understand that it's very, very difficult, but I think the proof is in the proverbial pudding, if you will. We have to get into that conversation.
Absolutely.
And the road usage fee, as Chairman knows, has been on the table for years. It's nothing new. It's been out there, but it hasn't been gelled at all and moved forward in any way, shape, or form. I also would say, as a local elected, and I'm sure many others here, understands and accepts, the whole context of tax increases right now is really coming to a boiling point across our region. And I think that we have to be cognizant of that. I'm sure that all of our legislators are conscious of that. But it is going to be a important element, I think, for us, if we can. I appreciate the agnostic approach, but I think if we can, to be somewhat creative in terms of suggestions that we might have that would help to provide a stabilized funding source. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Director Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure if this question is for you or Leanne, but I'm a little concerned about how we're building consensus with the service boards in terms of these legislative reforms, because some of the issues potentially that will be addressed by any reforms are the very ones that have caused us problems at this table over the 16 years that I've been sitting here. So how do we build consensus so that the legislature doesn't become frustrated with us and, in a sense, throw out the baby with the bathwater?
Rob has those wonderful
I
weekly
think
meetings.
I mean, you're raising a very important point. I mean, one of the, these are not new. We've been having this kind of conversation with the service boards for months now. I think there's still, like, as they say, the devil's still in the details. I think that, we're going to have to get a lot more specific about some of these things. But so sort of just step back a little bit from the 2 points that I'll make is, one, we've heard loudly and clearly from the legislature and taxpayers and the public, if you're going to get more money, there's got to be some reform. I mean, they've been very explicit about that. So from our perspective, sort of the guiding approach on all of this has been, let's not talk about sort of just organizing things. There's a lot of conversation about governance. Well, what does that mean? Like, what are we really talking about? We've sort of tried to switch the conversation or move the conversation to more outcome-based. Where are the pain points, or where are the issues that we've struggled with in the past, and how could we do some things differently to work towards the better outcome or a different outcome that we're sort of stating that we want. Those 3 areas of sort of the fares and the customer service, the service standards, and the capital prioritization are 3 areas. And I think anybody who's been on the board for a while, we know you're exactly right. They're the sort of been the pain points or the pressure points that we've experienced for some time. I think we've made some evolution in those things. Even Hirsch, under his description of the new dashboard showing the 15 or so criteria by which we're now evaluating capital projects, that the service boards now have to consider that when they're putting together their capital list. But again, you don't have the discrete sort of way to influence more on a earlier level as this project versus that project. More specifically, where if there's a bigger project that everybody's talking about in the region, how does RTA more meaningfully engage on the front end? You've had a lot of conversation about Lakeshore Drive and, the consideration of bus on shoulder as an example, or bus lanes in that corridor. Again, we're kind of weighing in at the end of the conversation, and we don't really have a way to meaningfully influence it. But if the conversation was happening on the front end, again, it's not sort of, I don't envision this as sort of this, really being really that specific, or really, what's the word? Not dictating the exact outcome, but sort of convening and still working through that collaboration, trying to get everybody together to come to a consensus around things. The other point that I did want to make is that I think one of the other things that we've heard as we've talked about sort of these 3 concept areas is that there's a lot of areas where the service boards by nature, operate different services, different kinds of services, always will, but freeing them up from some of that burden to think about how do you integrate a fare system across 3 very different operations, across 3 very different, not just modes, but the breadth and depth of service that they provide. So can we, as the regional entity that has that ability to sort of think through that more holistically, how do we influence that? Is there, better contracting that could happen on, the fare payments, the fare administration side of things, that we could sort of take a higher level roll certain things up to the regional entity to free the 3 service boards up to do what they do, are better served to do, and better operate the buses and trains on a daily basis. Rob, anything?
Yeah, one other thread I just would connect here is that is important. There was I think, a conscious effort to determine what are the managerial administrative things that the RTA is probably better suited to take on so that the service boards can focus on where they are experts, which is service delivery. And so that is sort of like dividing line that we use, but we can't, there's other conversations around governance, and I just want to connect the dots here on something. One of the reasons why we believe the supermajority requirement at this board has been effective is obviously it drives consensus across the region. If we are going to change how we operate, and that can be uncomfortable, right? Because it's not what we've done in the past, it's change. One of the ways to sort of provide everyone the confidence that they're going to have a seat at the table is to maintain that supermajority requirement. And so all of a sudden, maybe I don't like X, Y, or Z detailed change, but I still know I have a voice at the ultimate decision making. And so our concerns about supermajority, which are, you know, mainly focused on, that's the funding is the challenge that's immediate and time specific, right? But the other idea is if you sort of open that up to a simple majority, people do get nervous and they are concerned about their role in the decision-making process. And by maintaining that, we think you can implement some of these other changes because, again, there's a confidence, a degree of confidence among all parties that, okay, my voice will be heard. And so they're connected. They're not separate issues, and they're not simply a defense of the status quo. I think our perspective is the supermajority enables greater reform than a simple majority would.
Just another point that, you know, some of the conversations in terms of the funding and the reform, I mean, this is a significant ask of the legislature and ultimately the taxpayers. And they also may be more discreet as to where the money comes from and how it goes. It may not, they may move away from a formula that just sort of, his money just gets split up this way or goes that way. They might actually get very specific and sort of say this pot of money or this amount of money, this stream of money would be used for X, Y, and Z. And so that could be another way to sort of force and help outcomes be sort of consequences to, not meeting certain service standards example. So I think there's been mention of that in the conversations, that they're not just necessarily going to write a blank check. There has to be changes to how things are done.
On the same wavelength as a number of my fellow board members, talking about how we could effectively lead, if they don't put everything together in one organization and it is a strengthened RTA. And where I sit today, I think we need more than the ability to make them come together 4 times a year and, get engaged earlier in the process. And you mentioned a minute ago, Leanne, building consensus. When I describe what the RTA staff does today, it's just they spend, 90% of your time just trying to, get these 3 boards together and move forward sometimes. So I don't think we want to end up in that same position. So I would argue that we have to have some, you said we don't want to dictate, and dictate's always a negative word, but be a decision maker. I think in many cases we should be. If you fast forward and CTA has a regional project to the scope of the Red Line extension, and Metro wants to move forward on a big project to create regional rail, and they both are huge billion-dollar projects, and we don't think we could get federal funding for both, what are we going to do? And the only CTA and Metro can't make those decisions individually, though they do in some ways today. I really, and I know I've talked about this before, I think when I first got on this board, I mean, the word region has to be in our job description, and none of those 3 individual service boards look at the overall region and what are the best, projects to move forward that affect the whole region. So I think we really need to argue for some real authority going forward for the RTA board. For instance, if there's a project where we want to see it happen, and there's one going on today, and I don't know what the current status is, and 2 service boards are moving along great, and the 3rd one's dragging their feet. How can we have the authority to say, no, thou shalt do this by this day because it's for the good of the region? So I just, I'd be urging us to fight for something, as much strength as we could. Oh, and I did have one simple question. What is our short-term bonding authority?
It's 200, but some of you probably recall the legislature had given us a temporary back in the,
200 million?
we went up to 400
Okay.
million at one point, but we paid that down. So
Okay, just
yeah, but
curious.
it's
if
not
that
like, I think,
tied or-
yeah, it's a relatively. It's okay, yeah, it was 150, so my original answer was right.
Okay, well,
Um,
get us
But we had gone as high, we had gone as high as 400 million on a, but again, that's borrowing, you're paying
No, I get it.
costs
I
on
get it.
borrowing, and, we used it to limp along through a fiscal crisis, back in sort of 2009, 10, et cetera, or even before that a little bit, but, it's not, again, it's not ideal, and 150 is
Right.
certainly not enough to get us
No, no.
anywhere.
Right, okay, thank you. Thank
Director Ganning.
I like the proposals that are listed here, but I know it mentions, improved service and accountability. So I think we should add efficiency as another selling point and emphasize how our reforms could improve efficiency. The legislators would probably like to see that.
Beyond.
Thank you, Chairman. Kind of going back to on the bullet, the third bullet, I'm very heartened to hear about just the importance of teaming up with the road building, agencies that I think there's a great story to be told. Obviously, 5 years ago, when they did pass the capital bill and a number of these agencies saw their budgets significantly increased, and then the carve out for transit. Building upon that, I think is really, really important in this story. With then again, some specific examples, and I could share a couple. I know a few years back when the Eisenhower Expressway was contemplated to be under construction, they were looking for some alternate routes. Cermak, Roosevelt, and North Avenue were considered, and for almost a year and a half, we're meeting at that time, my previous job with DuPage on signal modernization, preemptions for cars, but transit wasn't at the table. And there was no talk of, and obviously technology today could allow there to be in those corridors a bus priority system. And so it's, again, nowhere in the road building agency's mind to be able to say, yeah, we think this is what transit needs. And so we don't have to talk about the big projects like a Lakeshore Drive, but just something as simple as, that on the off system improvements would be a big deal to have transit a part of that. And then another example, obviously in some of these hearings that the Senate Chairman of Transportation had, you heard folks over and over again say bus pads for pace or bus pads at pace stops were a big deal. And I know that was a big thing in Cook County, that it really is the road building industry that knows how to do that the right way. And once again, being able to have, RTA be the lead to say, these are the corridors we want the road building industry to look at, because it is a complicated process. It's a sidewalk, it's an ADA compliance, it's working with the local municipalities, but just empowering some of these local road building agencies to say that's what should be a priority, I think is a theme that's going to really resonate down in Springfield. They did this, they could do it again. The close partnership with the road builders who are going to complain that maybe money is going to transit, but let's, preempt that by saying it's a closer partnership. So again, very heartened that that's part of the bullet points here, and keep up that great message. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, John, very much. Any other questions or comments? So it has been almost 30 hours, literally 30 hours of hearings with the Senate, which Rob and Kevin and Anthony, they all sat through, and I've sat through virtually all of them as well. One thing that did make me crazy at those meetings, and I read yesterday, there was a staffer of one of the major agencies in metropolitan Chicago saying we have the power to do this stuff and we don't exercise our power. That's not true. And there was one example where a senator told us to do something, and Leanne pointed out we are prohibited under the act from doing things. So, we have got to let the powers that be know we don't have those powers. I wish we did. but we don't have them. But there was a perception out there that we have to debunk, that we have the power to do things today that we're not exercising, and that's really not true. Am I wrong at that? So we need, I favor the option of bringing us more authority and letting us be the new coordinating agency, the reform, so to speak. We need our list of $100 million of savings, of which we can come up with for the legislature. The governor, I think, is really, we've met with Bria Scudder, his transportation expert and guru. I think the governor's watching what's going on with the legislature, and, I think he wants to hear from us as to what we want as well. So it's a long road ahead, but we're making progress, and I will tell you, our staff does an amazing job of touching, like they did in the original creation of transit is the answer, with hundreds and hundreds of people and policymakers. And Rob has lived with these legislatures. He's now a permanent fixture on legislators' minds. Every time I see one, they always say, thank Rob, thank your staff. So keep it up. It's a long road. Anything else on this particular topic? Thank you all. Let's move on to item 7A, and it's a resolution setting the 2025 RTA board meeting schedule. Please note there are some meetings that are different from the normal third Thursday of the month cadence. In March and July and October, we're going to be the fourth Thursday of the month, and in June and September, they're the second Thursday of the month. And there's a variety of reasons for those, but just note, don't get into the habit of the third Thursday of the month. Just make sure I just entered them all in my calendar as we're here. Just note they may differ just a little bit next year. Any questions or comments on the schedule?
And I will send out the calendar invites like I usually do.
Good.
So
Thank you.
everyone
Thank
should
you
have
very
them
much.
once we approve or them set.
And our attendance has been, I thank you all, magnificent throughout the years and throughout the time I've been here. But get them in and just put them in your calendars, and Joey will send you, the invites. If there's no comments or questions, how about a motion? We need a motion in a second, right, Joey? Director Carey moves that we approve the schedule, seconded by Dr. Sager. With that, Joey, call the roll, please.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson? I'll come back to him. Dr. Fuentes?
Aye.
Dr. Gathing?
Aye.
Dr. Gorman? Dr. Groven?
Aye.
Dr. Lewis?
Aye.
Dr. Melvin? Dr. Pang?
Yes.
Dr. Rotundo?
Aye.
Dr. Ross?
Yes.
Dr. Sager?
Yes.
Dr. Yonan?
Aye.
Chairman Dillard?
Yes.
And then Director Colson? It's 13 ayes.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. So the schedule for next year, 2025, is adopted. Item 7B through 7D are the approval of the contract expenditure items as they have appeared in the board schedule and you've been sent. And the items for consideration include item 7B, our two ordinances authorizing the reappointment of our two pension trustees. And I know the staff is here if you have any questions on them. Sort of they're excellent and experts in that field, and it's sort of a thankless job, but they're very important. Item 7C is an ordinance authorizing a contract for media purchasing and in strategy, and 7D are the approval of travel expense reimbursements. Any questions or comments on any of those three? If not, how about a motion in a second that we approve them? Director Lewis moves, seconded by Director Gorman, that we approve those three items on 7B through 7D. With that, Joey, you want to take a roll call, please?
Sure. Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Aye.
Dr. Fuentes?
Aye.
Dr. Gathing?
Aye.
Dr. Gorman?
Aye.
Dr. Groven?
Aye.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes.
Dr. Pang?
Yes.
Dr. Rotundo?
Aye.
Dr. Ross?
Yes.
Dr. Sager?
Yes.
Dr. Yonan?
Aye.
And Chairman Dillard.
Yes,
13
so
ayes.
those are approved. Item 8, it's hard to believe we're down to new business, but that's good. Item 8 is new business. Is there any new business to come before the board today? We are going to go to executive session, but I want to remind the board that the next meeting will be November 22nd of 2024 at 9 a.m. And please note, this meeting is on Friday. It's on Friday, not Thursday. And November 22nd, for those of us who lived through President Kennedy's presidency, is a day we will never forget in terms of that date. That's like 9/11 is emblazoned. I know exactly where I was when I learned that President Kennedy was assassinated. So it's the 22nd of November. Allison, you want to read, before we adjourn, the exception of why we have to move to, or are allowed to move to executive session?
Sure. Thanks, Chairman. Pursuant to subsections 2C21 and 2C32 of the Open Meetings Act, the board may now vote to move
22.
into and adjourn from executive session at this time.
Thank you. We need any kind of motion to do that? We do. Excuse me, Director Carey moves that we move into executive session, seconded by Director Yonan. We will not return. There's no need to return. Executive session should be fairly quick, or quickly. We will we'll have that. So with that, you have to take a roll call on going to executive session? Okay, let's just, is there leave for the last
Leave. Leave.
roll call? Leave, seeing all ayes, no nays, no objections, leave is granted, and we'll move into executive session. How about a real motion to adjourn? Our real session before we go into executive session. Director Fuentes moves we adjourn, seconded by Director Rotundo. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.